Hi, Jasmine.
Hi, Louis. How are you?
I'm great. How are you today?
Good. Thursday.
Good. That's right. That's right. Well, we're getting close to the weekend, and the spring is here. Thank you for joining me today to have a curious conversation between friends about all the great work you've been doing and sustainability and fashion in general. So thanks for
Yeah,
being
thank you
here.
for having me.
Yeah. Where are you actually sitting today?
I'm in New Jersey.
You're in New
It's
Jersey.
very
Good
nice and
stuff.
sunny outside.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear it. Well, it is here too. I'm in the Bay Area, as you know, so it's kind of always stays that way, but
Yeah.
it's definitely a nice spring. So I was thinking, as I was preparing for our conversation, you're one of these people. Now you probably don't know this, but you're one of these people I think about more often than we actually ever interact, because you're educating me constantly. And when I read your work and when I follow what you're doing, which has been for nearly a decade, I suppose now, you're in my mind more often, and I think that's one of the things that kind of comes across. But when did we meet? I must have been over at Cradle to Cradle when we first met.
Yeah, I think you were definitely a cradle to cradle. Yeah, I'm sure we got acquainted that way. I think we met in person at the BFDA Impact Awards. I think we were both being
Yes,
honored at the same time.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
definitely true. I know that's when we connected in person, probably for the first time.
Mhm.
Good memory. Thank you. So for those that are kind of piping in, a lot of people that are working in sustainable fashion will know your name, but tell us a little bit, but some won't. So tell us a little bit about like who you are and your journey in this work.
I am now the sourcing and labor editor at Sourcing Journal. It's a trade publication, so I write about the apparel and footwear industry through the lens of sustainability and human rights.
Mhm.
Uh, Before that, I was freelancing for several years, and before that, I was the managing editor of this website called Ecoterra,
Mhm.
and it was one of the first websites to just focus on fashion and sustainability and the issues that were coming up around at that time. It was still a relatively niche idea. I know people are still talking about hemp, uh,
Mhm.
and I'm glad we've evolved beyond that right now.
That's right. Well, now we're talking about it in a new way because just recently
Cottonized hemp.
seeing that's right. That's right. So it's like it's evolving for sure. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. So tell me about Ecoterra. When did you launch that, and what was the inspiration?
It was in what was it? 2009, September
Hmm.
2009.
Hmm.
It spun out of a website called Inhabitat that's still around. It's
Yeah.
Inhabitat's a green architecture and building website, and the editor in chief, Jill Fahrenbacher, she was covering a bit of fashion because it was starting to crop up around that time about sustainability and eco-friendlier fabrics, and the audience wasn't really receptive. There were mostly a lot of architecture people, and
Hmm.
they didn't really care about fashion that much, and they didn't understand why it was so vital. And so she decided to just spin it out into its own website where it could occupy its own
Hmm.
space.
Yeah. So 2009. So that really does kind of put you at the forefront of conversation around sustainable fashion. And as you
Yeah.
said, at that time, a lot of it was around kind of what still imagine a lot of people still think of who aren't working in the space. Like we know that it's kind of on steroids now, and we'll talk about
Hmm.
that. But I think for a lot of people, it's still like, well, what does eco sustainable mean when is that just organic content? Is that recycled bottles made into t-shirts? Like, what are we talking? And I think to help people understand in 2009 it was pretty basic, right? What were you
It was.
addressing? Yeah.
Yeah, we had questions like, why should we care about organic cotton? We're not going to eat the cotton.
Yeah.
This is totally ground level stuff at that point.
Right. And chemistry, like just the beginning to maybe think about, you mean these dyes might not be healthy for people or
Exactly.
planet? Like that was an
Mhm.
early consideration around textile dyes, and probably for others joining this conversation still is like to understand that dyes have a negative impact, right?
Right. And then this was also before Rana Plaza, which really changed a lot of
Hmm.
public perception about, labor rights and just how the cut and sew industry is like. Before that, people had almost zero awareness, I think, in the public consciousness at least.
Yeah. Yeah, that you bring up a good point, which I think a lot of this social responsibility part of the textile apparel industry really started like in the 80s and 90s around labor, right? That's where the awakening, where a lot of
Mhm.
big brands were being called out for issues related to sweatshops, a term we used to use a lot, and
Yeah.
child labor, even before we started to kind of evolve into the concept of forced labor, which is certainly what we're talking about now too. And
Mhm.
so even it seems to me, and tell me if you agree or disagree, it seems like some of the early conversation of this work and the exploration on the sustainability side kind of rolled out of that worker rights side too, didn't it?
I think so. I think it's a natural extension of that, that clothes aren't just being made from machines being stamped out in a factory line with no human touch or pollution or anything like that. I think there was a slow awareness growing out of that, much like how the food movement developed. It started talking about the rights of farmers and then the health of soils and the health of people and chemicals,
Mhm.
and it just starts moving in a stream that way.
That's right. Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because I think there's a lot to learn from and a lot of interesting intersections between how food and agriculture
Mhm.
shifted the conversation to the citizen consumer and
Yeah.
how that changed purchasing and buying decisions. And then to say, that like Walmart is one of the largest, sellers of organic milk in the country, if not the largest, purchaser and or reseller of that as a retailer, and that there's a similar kind of movement I think that's happening in the fashion and apparel space. Do you think there are two industries that can be compared in terms of how they've evolved, or how fashion could learn from?
Yes, I absolutely think so, and that's why in the sustainable fashion movement in comparison is still very nascent. But we also have to remember that I think the organic food movement took like 50 years to really take off into the mainstream,
Yeah.
and so there are definitely lessons that we can learn on how to improve the messaging and the communications. I think food has been really good with that because it's so personal. It goes inside
Mhm.
your body, and I think with fashion, I think relating to that clothes are also very personal, also a very part of your body, can help bring that kind of evolution toward greater awareness and greater concern about the state
Mhm.
of the industry.
I love that you're framing it in the context of movement because I think as a writer and a storyteller, being able to see the arcs of these
Mhm.
movements, and I find myself talking about fashion that way too because you mentioned architects and designers before. I got into
Mhm.
this work through that space, the built environment
Mhm.
space, and coming from Mohawk Industries and looking at the textile side of flooring, carpet, and then the circular economy piece of that. And I would say, when I got into that work, that space was 15 to 20 years in the built
Mhm.
environment from the early 90s. Now, one might say green building really started in the 70s and the 80s. You had a lot of front leaders like Bill McDonough who launched Cradle to Cradle, and
Mhm.
but the real movement from the built environment and the architect design space was really when policy got involved, right? So that when
Yes.
LEED certification is no longer the standalone, but it's actually a baseline for state new construction, existing building, right? So you got excited. I'm going to
Mhm.
be quiet and let you talk about that a little bit because I think there's other parallels to like when a movement hits where actually the work becomes policy, right?
Yeah, exactly. With food, we have standards. We have nutritional standards. What's how much sugar, how much salt, and how much fat it should have. We have no such regulations with
Hmm.
clothing. How much
Hmm.
the level of chemicals. I mean, there might be
Yeah.
some baselines over there, but there's nothing that's really universal or really broadly applied across the industry. And I think that's where real change can come in. I think I've had so many conversations with people about how um, self-regulation has really hit its limit at certain points, and we really need government intervention to really push it over the edge.
Yeah, I like that you say that because I think you're right, which is that, corporations are not in business to regulate themselves. They're in business
Mhm.
to create profit. And so I'm not demonizing that in any way. That's they're there to make a product or service, but then to actually earn wealth for the owners, shareholders, et
Mhm.
cetera. So putting them in the position of trying to self-regulate is just going to be a mistake from the beginning to some
Mhm.
extent, right?
Yeah.
Do you kind of agree with that? I mean, it sounds like you do agree with that.
I'm I think, in the 10, 12 years I've been doing this, it's really clear that what is needed is better laws. I
Yeah.
think there's no way around it. I mean, as there are companies that are well-meaning, and there are multi-stakeholder initiatives that are also well-meaning, but without legally binding
Mhm.
agreements, I think not a lot is going to get done. A lot is going to get said, but whether that's
Yeah.
applicable to some tangible result, really remains to be seen.
Yeah. So you mentioned the concept of having standards and having a standard within food and agriculture or buildings. So we do have certifications and certain standards.
Mhm.
Do you think the evolution, the value of having certifications and standards is that they can ultimately be written into policy? Is that like, if you look at it from like why they're here and why the importance of them are, like how do you see that standards world? And of course I came from a standards world. I have a thought too,
Yeah,
but I
I
want
know.
to hear
I,
what
I
you
think I
say.
think you're better informed than I am when it comes to standards and certifications.
Yeah,
I think they can, like, pave the way. I mean,
yeah,
we can look at what's working with these different
right.
standards and certifications, what's not working, and maybe
Yeah,
can come together to create something that is just beneficial for the industry as a whole.
yeah, yeah. So if we're 10, 12 plus years into sustainable fashion movement, where are we if you were to benchmark us against, like, where are we and what's coming next? I think if you were to look at it across these other sectors you discussed, do you have any insights or thoughts?
It's so hard to say. I mean, I would say that awareness seems to be peaking, but then I'm also so deep in the weeds that I can't really tell if it's not in other
Yeah.
parts of the industry. But I think social media has really created this like groundswell of awareness that we didn't anticipate.
Yeah.
um and with grassroots movements like Remake and Fashion Revolution, they're really good at really marshaling social media momentum and the energy of the younger generations, the Gen Zs, who are really passionate about these issues. And I think that has really accelerated the pace at what we might have gone without
Mhm.
social media.
Yeah. I fully agree. I think that it is, for better or worse, it creates transparency, right? And then people and
Mhm.
viral information, and sometimes that information may not be exactly accurate. So it's all about credible journalism. But
Mhm.
to lean into the importance of why the value that you and your peers bring tremendous value around that, fact-based driven journalism, because there is a lot of confusion. I think even in
Mhm.
sustainable fashion for people to sort through. What has So that being said, like what has changed? You've been writing about this space for a while, and you and I are both kind of in our bubble around sustainable
Yeah.
fashion. But as you look at it, what's changing? Because to me, it feels like everybody's talking about it all the time now.
Well, in the beginning, like let's say like 10 years ago, people would be really excited if a brand had a capsule collection made from like recycled plastic bottles, like swimsuits made
Hmm.
from recycled plastic bottles. Today, it's a pretty different impact. If a brand does that, you'll be hearing people on Twitter, on TikTok, or Facebook talking about, well, what percentage of that capsule
Hmm.
collection is really part of your whole collection. Is it
Hmm.
just, if it's just 2% of your products, you're not really making much of an impact. Are you actually making a systemic change and replacing
Hmm.
all your virgin plastic with recycled plastic? I think people are more savvy now, and they're demanding more, and they're less susceptible to what we call greenwashing, you know um, which I guess it's good to be more suspicious when brands say certain things. We have to hold it up to a little bit of a higher standard than we did maybe 10 years ago, when innovations weren't as advanced, and
Right.
the fabrics weren't as readily available.
Yeah.
Now it's a different story.
Yep, I fully agree with you. And even the work that we're doing at Apparel Impact Institute, when Linda Greer founded the Clean by Design initiative, it
Mhm.
was it was a pilot. It was like, let's figure this out. Let's see if we can scale an efficiency program that actually yields a return on investment plus a average lowering of carbon and water, and all the benefits. And then it got to a point where it's like, this should be table stakes. Like, why is every
Yeah.
facility not operating with some kind of energy efficiency program in place, whether it's this one or others? And I think that what I'm kind of hearing you say is this shift from testing and experimenting early stage to now that transition to what is table stakes, right? Which
Yeah.
beyond capsuled collections. That could be
Yeah,
there.
that brands should actually be making changes to their entire business model rather
Right.
than just testing out like small little pockets of effort that, doesn't
Yeah.
really make much of a difference in the long run.
Yep. So do you see that? I mean, do you see in your, I mean, you're talking to everybody. As you're out
Mhm.
writing and have been for a decade, you're getting a front row seat. Do you think there is an evolution from testing to actually making it core sourcing strategies or core business model strategies?
I think so. I think it really depends on the brands, but you're seeing more commitments now where where you had like Adidas saying they're replacing all of their polyester from virgin to recycled. You have like Ralph Lauren saying that they're going to use the recycled cotton from natural fiber welding and so on, where it's a larger scale change, a sea change throughout the organization, rather than, oh, we're just going to make this small amount of t-shirts out of recycled cotton.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think the conditions, like as you're talking, I'm thinking like the conditions have to be there too. It's like brands have to step in, but then you're starting to change the value chain, right? And then all of a sudden it's
Mhm.
easier for everybody to start sourcing because there's a higher demand. And so it's kind of like everything kind of goes along together, right? It's like your
Yeah.
commitments impact the whole industry. And so we need everybody's kind of doubling down. And it sounds like that's what you're seeing too, is that commitment to, and it makes it easier on a company to do it when you actually know you can get those materials or you can make those sourcing decisions.
Right. So I think that's why you see the biggest and more ambitious commitments coming from the conglomerates like Kering or VF Corp, where they can actually leverage their size to make better deals for their brands and get the quantities that they need.
Yeah,
I think
that's right.
sourcing is still an issue about whether you can get as much organic cotton as you really require, and of course pricing is always a concern with companies.
Hmm. Yeah, and and have you written a lot about sustainable pricing over the years? Have you kind of looked at that in terms of like the big question in the room is, will the prices of in products have to shift? Will they shift? And is that okay? And like what is your thought
Yeah.
on that? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a question I always ask, whenever there's a new innovation, like a new recycle or a new like vegan leather, for example, made from
Hmm.
mushrooms or whatever. It's like how scalable is it? What is the premium that we're looking at? Because customers, although they say they're willing to pay more for sustainable products, in practice I think that's a little bit iffier whether they're actually willing to. So brands have to be able really to absorb that green premium in the beginning, as the innovation scales up and reaches the kind of level where prices can start naturally to come down.
Yeah, it's almost like stimulating this up front because there's
Mhm.
stimulus in all other form. There's stimulus in petroleum, there's stimulus money and for certain types of unconventional agriculture, and so there's certainly a way to figure that out, but
Mhm.
it has it yet to be done, I guess is the question. So certainly something
Yeah.
we're all watching. So let's talk about a little bit about you individually then. So much. Do you sleep well at night? Are you optimistic? Like how do you feel it's going? And yeah, what's your general outlook on sustainability in the apparel fashion sector?
I try not to have too much an opinion of things because that would cloud my reporting. I try to stay as fair as and neutral
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
possible. So I'm trying to be
Yeah.
as fair to the brands as possible,
Yes.
but also to the NGOs and the watchdog groups that also bring up interesting questions. So
Hmm.
um, I like my pieces to be nuanced in a way. There are always pros and cons to everything, different
Yeah.
sides of the
Yeah.
coin. Um, I guess generally I'm optimistic. I'm also very jaded
Yeah. Yeah.
from, like every Earth Day, for example, I get all these emails about, these new collections that come out during Earth Day. I'm like, why can't you just do that all year round?
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
so
We
I
we
think there
just
is
had that
momentum
conversation earlier.
gathering.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to say that Vandana Chavari, who was the former editor at large at Vogue, and I talked to her last week, and she said the same thing. Like,
Mhm,
I'm tired of this. It hits in the new year, the new green collections, or
mhm.
it hits in Earth Month in April. Like, why can't we do this all year? But it
Yeah.
does feel like you said, as it moves from capsule collection and moves to core sourcing
Mhm.
strategies and preferred material percentages and carbon reduction program, it's going to be more baseline to all the operations. Sounds like you agree with that is
Yeah.
accelerating. Yeah,
Yeah, it does. It does have to move to the
yeah,
main line for it to have any kind of difference. And Levi's is really good at doing that. They have their well
hmm
thread collection where they do
hmm
test things like the cottonized hemp we were talking about, but then they move it, and that's the
yeah.
important piece of it.
Explain to the audience what cottonized hemp, what that refers to.
Oh, hemp, from the stereotypes we have about hemp, it's scratchy, kind of
hmm
rough feeling.
hmm
Cottonized hemp is a way to make it to turn those hard, crunchy fibers into a fluff that's like cotton. And so
hmm
it's easier for the looms to handle, there's less breakage, it
hmm
feels nicer to wear. So that is what I think the hemp industry is trying to look into to get that kind of uptake that we need.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say because a lot of natural fibers have gone through versions of that now where, you'll pick up
Mhm.
sweaters that are once upon a time your wool sweater could be potentially uncomfortable. And now you'll see these beautiful soft merinos and other kinds of wools where you're like, wow, this is wool. It's not a blend. It's actually 100% wool, but it has such a almost cashmere like feel to it because I
Yeah.
think the technologies and innovations around getting these fibers to be workable is a big part of the key, right? Because we
Mhm.
want to have style and design and comfort and all lead, and we want to build sustainability in, right?
Right, because consumers, they want sustainability, but more than that, they want it to be priced well, and they want it to be
hmm
something that they'll actually wear.
Right. Comfortable,
Mhm.
beautiful. Yeah, that
Mhm.
meets all the reasons why you would buy something. We can't compromise style, performance, fashion for sustainability.
Mhm.
They have to go together, right? To
Yeah,
otherwise,
absolutely.
otherwise we're
Yeah, it
just
has to be like
going
it has to
downhill.
hit all those points to
Yeah.
work with consumers.
And I think that's important for people to understand too, that like there's a lot of pieces that have to fit to make this whole equation work, and so that it can
Mhm.
be scalable, right? Otherwise it just stays as a special collection, and that's what we're
Scalability
saying
is
can't
so
work.
important. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
otherwise it just doesn't have the same reach.
yeah. So that being said, as we're talking about, the cottonized hemp, like what else are you seeing out there that you think is really either groundbreaking or it's inspiring you to learn more about it, or you're encouraged? Is there anything on the horizon for sustainable fashion?
Um, Well, I think, we're talking a lot about recycling technologies, before in the years before, cotton and polyester blends were impossible to recycle. And so we're seeing some interesting things come out of Hong Kong and H&M. They're working together to actually be able to take these blends and turn them into recycled polyester on one end, and then like a cotton powder on the other. And I think the cotton powder can be used to spin new fibers, or
hmm
applied on agricultural fields to hold
hmm
water better, so that the crops use less water. So that's really interesting, but it's still in a niche stage, and it really needs to be scaled up for it to have any long-term impact. So
Absolutely.
that's really interesting.
I think you're referring to the folks at HK Rita and Edwin
Yeah.
Kay and his. Yes, I've been there and seen the work. Have you been to see the work firsthand? It's
No,
yeah.
no.
Well, we have a trip ahead of us when the world resumes
Yeah.
because it'd be great to get you there. It's what they're doing is great, and I agree. I think the global scalability is going to be the exciting part about those innovations. And for
Yeah.
people listening to it, like blends is when you're blending materials that can't be recycled on the back end, and you
Mhm.
end up with something that you can't do anything with. But Edwin and his team at HK Rita, with support from H&M Foundation, have really been leaning into turning those into blended yarns and other ways in which they can take the materials and you reuse them in a way that's really pretty exciting when you think about it. It's pretty groundbreaking.
Yeah, yeah, because
Yeah,
all the take back programs in the world. I mean, you take back all these blends, which is like 90% of clothing today. I mean, if you can't
yeah.
do anything with it, there's really no point. It's gonna end up in the landfill.
Yeah, everybody wants a pair of jeans that they look good in, and that means it probably has some kind of plastic,
Yeah.
petroleum, nylon, elastane, or something blended in with the cotton for sure, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I know the HK reader, it can handle elastine as well. I mean, it comes
yeah.
out as an output that's as a contaminant, so they haven't figured
Hmm.
out what to do with it, but at least
Hmm.
it can manage it.
They can pull it out. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. That's great. So, so let's then talk about like who inspires you, like in this space. Are there individuals that you're following, or not even in this space, just like in the world in general? What's keeping you inspired, or who?
Oh, you mentioned Linda Greer, and she's just so
Hmm.
fantastic. She is such an inspiration. I mean,
Hmm.
she tells it like it is. She doesn't mince words. She
She
won't,
does.
f- cotton, wool, anything, and it's so great because that's what we need. We need transparency. We need, the real talk.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Linda has been a real mentor to me for a long time too. And of course, she
Hmm.
created this Clean by Design program that we're scaling
Hmm.
at AII. But we had her on the Lewis and Friends podcast back in January, and she's just amazing. So yeah, I agree. And then what about any books or podcasts or anything that you're following that you think people would be inspired to learn about?
I read anything by Paul Hawken,
Hmm.
natural capital and things like that. That's always
Yeah,
very inspiring about how, we can work with nature rather than against it. So, anything by him. Um,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I think
Paul's
so.
great.
Yeah.
Paul is great, and the Ecology of Commerce, which was written in what 92 or 93 or something, was a real driver towards building the circular economy concepts and cradle to cradle, and a lot. I mean, when I got into the carpet industry, they were all talking about the Ecology of Commerce and Paul Hawken, and that was and he been that book had already been out for a decade, so it's hard to believe we've it's like, and Paul is still really driving so much wisdom and leadership too. I
It was
agree.
so prescient, right? His book. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
that
yeah, and
we're still talking about it and still using it.
yeah, natural capitalism, ecology of commerce, and then maybe 10 years later, Cradle to Cradle came out. But they were all, that's the sort of early books that really drove a lot of this work
Yeah.
for different
Yeah, Cradle
sectors and
to Cradle
industries.
too was a very
Yeah,
influential book when I was just starting out in this space.
yeah, changed my life. I'm sitting here talking
Yeah.
to you because of that
Yeah.
book. So, well, great. Well, I just, could continue. I say this to everyone, but I really mean it. I could continue to talk forever. So let's find something to collaborate on, or any upcoming
Absolutely.
articles you are writing. I'd love to talk some more, and then you can ask me all the questions. but,
Yeah.
but,
Yeah.
but
We
thank
were
you so
talking
much
about
for this time.
financing. AII has such a great financing system.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That is something we should talk about because we're doing some real looking into the financial tools that will be needed to finance a lot of this work, and it's not going to be just corporate treasury or just debt or equity or philanthropy. It's going to be like a combination of all of it. So I think there's a
Yeah.
real strong. We could dive in there for sure. Yeah,
Yeah. It's
yeah.
and the importance of collaboration, true collaboration among all stakeholders.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's really key. And when you were talking about the brands and the sort of conglomerate of brands like VF Core and some of these and Caring, where they have a number of brands below them, they can operate amongst all these individual brands as one, and that's something the whole industry has a hard time doing because of antitrust and environment
Mhm.
and potential issues of price fixing. But AII works in that pre-competitive space, and so I think
Yeah.
like what you were describing, I was like, oh yeah, that does get to happen when you've got 10 to 20 brands inside your house. You can do a lot of that big
Mhm.
movement work. But then ultimately, we are asking so all the big players and medium-sized players too to kind of come together and start. Don't do this alone. You share the supply chain, you share the
Right.
suppliers and the materials. Let's all come up with an agreements on how to move as one, and then we can help scale programs together. Yeah.
And you share the risks too.
That's absolutely right. Yeah,
Yeah.
you have to share the risk. And there's some risk in some of these early stage things, right? Like how are we going to get the industry off coal? Or, I'm curious to know
Mhm.
as you sort of dive into like how are we going to tackle some of these big issues? That risk has to be absorbed collectively. It can't be on,
Mhm.
one brand's back because then, it doesn't like from a design thinking perspective, it seems like Don't you agree? Like we wanna actually start sharing what worked, what didn't, share our failures, really kind of
Exactly.
open the hood,
Yeah.
right? Yeah,
Yeah. You
yeah,
share the burden, you share the joy.
yeah. You share the burden, you
Mhm.
share the joy. That's great.
Mhm.
Well, any parting wisdoms or philosophies you'd like to leave us with today?
No, just stay safe, socially distance, and mask up.
That is definitely the wisdom of this week. We're not as I was talking to someone recently, she said I wake up every day and I say the coast is not clear. So
Exactly.
so we're not there yet, but
No,
stay
we're
safe.
almost there, and we
Yeah,
shouldn't relax now because we're almost there.
I'm with you. Well, have a wonderful day and as you go into the weekend. And Jasmine, thank you so much, first of all, for joining me, but secondly, for just being a voice in this work. That's, we're gonna put your website in the links because I want people to see the full body of work. And certainly they can join you at Sourcing Journal and read
Mhm.
if they're in the industry or not. They can always subscribe. But we'll make sure that we're getting people to see the great work. You're a font of information based on all the investigative reporting you've done over the years in this space.
Thank you. I'm just a conduit. I talk to the really smart people like yourself, and I just relay the information.
Well, I talk to the smart people and then I relay that to you. So so together we'll get the information out there.
Yeah,
Thank you so
great.
much, Jasmine. Yeah,
Thank you
have a
so much,
wonderful day.
Lewis.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.